Good evening, you faithful Lenten journeyers. It's good to have you here. And those who are joining us this evening, welcome. The beauty of COVID, or they're going to be watching us and listening to the family chat with the president. So maybe they'll phone in and tell us the good news or whatever. So this evening we're going to be doing the fifth commandment, you shall not kill and you shall not commit adultery. And I think these really start speaking to the real things in life that we encounter. Not that the others weren't, but I felt personally rather moved by it as I listened to it earlier in preparation. So let us pray. Spirit of truth and judgment, who alone can exorcise the powers that grip our world, at the point of crisis, give us your discernment, that we may accurately name what is evil and know the way that leads to peace. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. Okay, so without further ado, moving on. Those are on.
Just take that.
Sorry about this. It was playing at home. Because she can hear you.
to begin to look at the laws of the heart that act. As a compass, as a magnet, as a direction for us in terms.
I'm just taking it right back so you can hear everything.
Now we're going to begin to look at the laws of the heart that act as a compass, as a magnet, as a direction for us in terms of our human relationships, the way we function within the human community itself. So we're not surprised then to find out that the fifth commandment is, "Thou shalt not kill." But it is not as simple, perhaps, as it may seem. While we sit in our living rooms and watch the television news at night, who has to be reminded that the world around us, the rest of the world, unarmed and undefended, is being pummeled to the point of extinction in our lifetime, everywhere around the globe. What does the tradition have to say to us about a state of culture like this? How, if at all, is the fifth commandment, "You shall not kill," any kind of a guide through an era such as this in our time, the killing society to end all killing societies? To save one life, the Talmud teaches, is to save the world. Why would you put that much weight on a single life? Because the rabbis teach in each and every life lies the fullness of the beauty and the potential and the hope of humankind. Surely then, life must be an overwhelming priority for us, and it has fallen upon our age to find our way through this to the fullest human development of the human heart. Our decisions and the effect that they have on the life around those who are made in the image of God must compel every act we perform, everywhere, in our kitchens and our garages, on our jobs and in our homes, every determination we arrive at in terms of what it is to be a holy person in this day and age, and surely every piece of legislation we pass or live by or seek. And yet, we kill with impunity in this society. We say we can kill to defend the state, we can kill to defend ourselves, we can kill to punish lawbreakers, though we know now, all the data tells us that this so-called deterrence does not deter at all. We kill soldiers and have the effrontery to call it defense. We kill non-combatants now in great numbers and call it collateral damage. That's the word you use for garbage. We argue for the right to kill both the very old and the very young. We kill through poverty, through neglect, and through greed. And we do all those things in the name of good, and so in the name of God. We kill any of them and all of them, and we never even have the grace to blush. We will argue about one kind of killing and call it absolute and never question the rest of the killings that we do. So we have to ask ourselves then, after thousands of years of the Judeo-Christian tradition, let alone total immersion in the Christian tradition itself, are things getting better or are they getting worse as time goes by? Is every generation less violent than the last? Well, the one thing we certainly know with certainty, we got the numbers now. 60% of all the war deaths of all time did not happen in ancient civilizations by uncivilized people. They happened in the 20th century. 60% of all the wartime deaths in all of history happened in your lifetime and mine. By using greater violence to stop violence, only new violence is being created. We become bloodthirsty in the name of goodness. In the name of God, we had a commander during the Vietnam War whose analysis of the situation was that we had to destroy the village, he said, in order to save it. Now, when your thinking gets that muddled, that tangled, that complex, that contradictory, you have got to know that you are deeply confused as a culture and as a civilization about both the nature of life and the power of death. Power, the Talmud teaches, buries those who wield it. And we may be getting closer to that every day. And power, once personal, always local, very individually controlled, has now, in your lifetime and mine, become global, become universal, become nuclear. You have to come to the awareness that armies don't fight armies anymore. They fight the unknown. And so they fight the women and the children, the old men and the young boys, and they kill whomever stands between them and the unknown enemy just in case. Sorry about that. You just happen to be in the area. And they call it necessary. And they call it good. We did it for holy, sorry about that. And we call it holy, this messianic people, whatever the cost of it. Power ruthlessly employed or carelessly administered often masks as virtue. We must begin to understand that the use of power itself is a call to sanctity. The United States, for instance, one of only 2 fully developed countries in the world, which, along with Japan, routinely practices capital punishment, is so sure of its criminal justice system that it dismisses as mistakes. Mistakes. The price to be paid for deterrence, criminal deterrence, despite the number of long-term death row cases that are now being just as routinely overturned as they were convicted on the basis of new evidence. Read your newspapers every day. They tell you 19 years, 27 years, 35 years, released to the family, because we now have another way to sort them out. But we don't have all the ways. Clearly, the 5th commandment warns us against our willingness to bring things down on the heads of others in the name of righteousness. But the Hebrew scriptures, on which the Judeo-Christian tradition rests, took over 1,000 years to develop, which explains, of course, why ideas taken for granted in one segment of the Bible may be very suspect in another. At first glance, for instance, the 5th commandment seems quite straightforward, doesn't it? Thou shalt not kill. I know that one. That's the easy one in its affirmation of human life. Have you read your Bible lately? The Bible itself is full of killing for crimes, such as violation of the Sabbath, adultery, bestiality, homosexuality, and sacrifice to other gods, as well as murder between human beings. Clearly, the fifth commandment is as complex in its implications as any of the other commandments are in theirs. Some Christian groups, for instance, call abortion murder under any circumstances, but other Christian and Jewish groups do not. Some people call war, all war, any war, as long as it's governmentally approved, justified. But some Christian groups do not. Some people call capital punishment a deterrent, but other groups call it barbarous. The question is why? How do we get into this? What is going on here? And what does that mean for all of us who are also trying to make those decisions in our own life? Well, it depends on what we really mean by the fifth commandment, and it depends on what we think as Christians that Jesus was really all about. Where's the confusion? The confusion began and centers around translation. It's a very serious language problem. It depends on whether or not you translate the fifth commandment as "you shall not kill" or "you shall not murder," as any Jewish scholar. The distinction between those words is what is determinative. To kill, the Jewish word is harag, includes the taking of life for any reason. Whatever you did, you killed. To murder, ratzah, refers only to criminal acts of killing. Now, early translations use the word meaning to kill, but respected Jewish scholars across the ages began to argue that that translation has been too narrow, that killing is necessary in many cases and not criminal at all. Rabbi Maimonides, on the other hand, who was kind of the Jewish, the Thomas Aquinas of 12th century Judaism, he wrote that all cases of killing human beings involve violation of the fifth commandment, even in the event of mitigating factors, mitigating circumstances. But the argument goes on to this day. Where is the original translation and implication? But even those who believe that the commandment forbids only criminal killing realize that that list has changed over the years. What was criminal in Jewish history? Sorcerers and blasphemers. So you could kill the local palm reader. Those who curse their parents could be killed. Rebellious elders who didn't follow the norms of the community, and those who broke the laws governing the Sabbath. They've all come on the list and off the list as the Hebrew community grew spiritually, psychologically, socially, and scientifically. And we ourselves have been in this for a long time. We look at killing through the consciousness of differences in intention. Did he really mean to do it? Awareness of degrees of guilt. Did she plan to do it? And a growing recognition of society's moral responsibility for all its life. It grew and it changed in Judaism across the years, and it has grown and changed in us as well, as we too are still growing through all of this and changing in our own hearts and in society's awareness. But for Christians, the struggle became even more troubling. Jesus did revolt, but Jesus revolted non-violently. Jesus did not become what he hated. And Jesus did not call his followers, even for his own sake, to respond violently. So he had every opportunity for a just war, and he didn't take it. He just said, no, Up to the time of Constantine in the 4th century, however, Christians did not join the army and they would not take up arms. They were followers of the nonviolent Jesus. But then we became the establishment. We became the system. We became the keepers of our society. And suddenly we found it very necessary to suppress others, to take other land for our own sakes, to become involved in wars for political reasons. And now in our time, the question is emerging again. Can a war ever be just in a nuclear age? Can a war using unmanned drones be run from a mountain in Colorado? From a drone that strafes unknown, unseen, and unidentified victims from the sky? How many feet up can that be just? Can we ever again distinguish between combatants and non-combatants? And if we can't, can war itself ever be defended again? All the justifications for war have been based on the distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and that's all gone. Is abortion murder or killing if we have no consensus as a people or a scientific community on the very meaning of life? Unless we decide and agree that this is life, how can you say that this is either murder or killing? Is stem cell research the destruction of life, or it's God-given creation? Is the elimination of feeding tubes for the terminally ill euthanasia or murder? And who decides? And how do we come to that decision? I can only tell you this. The Parliament of Religion, the gathering of every major religious leader on the planet in 1993, affirmed that there was a commonality among all of us. They affirmed that one of the 4 universal ethical postures taken by every major religious tradition in the world is that life is to be affirmed, protected, honored, and sustained. All of us. So what's the 5th commandment saying to us while our own definitions of life and war are shifting? Well, surely it says that life is worth struggling for. That life is worth struggling to define. That we must stay in this discussion until we know in our hearts what is right, what is life, where it comes from, what we are to do. Surely it is saying that we cannot take war for granted, killing for granted, any killing for granted, and anyone else's life as cheap. Surely it says that we must have a grave and serious commitment to life at all times and in all circumstances. It says we must do everything we can to preserve life, everybody's life, not just our own, in all instances, at all times. The Chinese proverb teaches, if murder is forgiven, heaven will find it hard to bear. Maybe it's time to realize that when we are not actively working to sustain life, all life, anywhere, we are actually undermining life everywhere. And will be next. The greatest sin against the 5th commandment may be our own indifference to what is going on that is sapping life out of our very world, the world around us in our own neighborhoods and families. Medicare, Social Security, food stamps, health insurance, and unemployment compensation are not simply last year's social programs. They are the very essence of what it means now in our society to sustain life for others, to refuse to be part of the killing, to make life livable for everyone. The life that we fail to enable and sustain, we condemn to death. The 5th commandment requires us to determine now in our own time, as the Chinese say, when, if ever, heaven will not weep over our own disregard for life in this time, in this century, even in this country.
One of the things that John says, that the world, such as we know it, we are a killing society to end all societies. And I was really touched in watching this. I mean, just over the past few weeks, we heard in Khayelitsha 5 people were killed. And then this past weekend again, 6 people, all of them were just shot. And it makes, it gives the impression that we've lost our humanity, and if we can just turn around, if people can just turn around and do that, power over and the abuse of power, that someone decided that they need to do that. One of the things that she writes in her book is we have to distinguish, and sometimes there's a fine line between power and virtue. All of the things, the example she was giving us was, it starts out virtuous. It's for a virtuous, righteous reason, and then it all gets messed up. But she didn't say it in this passage, but she writes in her book, John Chittester writes, when we change the law, if we must not look at it negatively and say, you shall not kill, it must become, you shall enable life. Give it a positive connotation. What a difference to say, you shall enable life, rather than to say, you shall not kill. And it is, she does say that it is late, but it's never too late. It's never too late. She writes, in her book, she writes a part about herself, and then she gives us something to work with. And then it says, and for you. So I like to read to you from and for you, which is this. She writes, when one part of life dies in us or is taken from us, it is resurrection time. Life is a series of little deaths, Charles Feldison wrote, out of which life always returns. It's about allowing life to return in us after loss and disappointment, or natural endings and social failures, that the 5th commandment is also about. So now look at my favorite one.
All right, today we're going to look at the 6th commandment, the heart of the law of commitment. Now, there's a problem with the 6th commandment. I don't need to know what yours is, but I am certainly clear that when we begin to analyze what's going on in this commandment, it is, in essence, very foreign to our own culture. And therefore, it's impossible to draw comparisons to the behavioral aspects of marriage in these two cultures. The problem with the sixth commandment, you shall not commit adultery, is that almost no one of significance in the Hebrew scriptures seems to keep it. At least not the way we define it. Solomon, Israel's first king, a model of wisdom, an exemplar of justice, had 700 wives. He was punished, of course, but he wasn't punished for having more than one wife. He was punished because many of his wives were foreigners who had brought their personal idols and gods with them to his palace. Indeed, the Hebrew scriptures are full of adulterous relationships, at least by our definition of it. Jacob, remember, married both Leah and Rachel. David took Bathsheba from her husband Uriah. And because Onan refused to sleep with his dead brother's wife, which Israel calls a Levirate marriage, so that she could have the children in her dead husband's name, Yahweh killed him. These things were not only common, they were legal. So what can this commandment possibly mean for us now? If it seems to have meant very little to Israel itself, at least again by our standards. Well, actually, in those terms, not much, really. Unless and until we understand that what they meant by adultery and what we understand by adultery are two very different things. In the Bible, adultery has nothing to do with the violation of a lifelong commitment of one person to another in a spiritual relationship of mutual support and endearment. In the Bible, adultery has to do with property rights, with inheritance, with who really deserves to share in the patrimony of the father. To sleep with another man's wife could dilute the bloodlines of the family, the inheritance lines of the family. It threatened, in other words, the integrity of his estate. It meant that someone not really a legitimate biological descendant of the father might get the property of the deceased. And yet, at the same time, in this commandment lie some very important principles, some very humanizing insights, some very spiritual dimensions of life. There were constants in ancient Hebrew marriage that have a great deal to say to any of us today about any relationship, simply because they superseded both romantic love or ownership. They have immense implications for the preservation of families. In the first place, romantic love was not the primary value of Hebrew marriage. A woman could simply be called out of the tribe and brought to the king. He didn't even have to know her. Instead, then, what is a primary value here? Duty and obligation define the moral boundaries of Hebrew marriage. The Hebrew husband and wife had responsibilities for one another that the entire culture understood and expected. They were meant to protect a family, and they were expected to keep those boundaries. Secondly, in biblical law, the idea of adultery is different for men than for women. In case you've ever heard that before, try to forget it. A man had the right to have more than one wife because wives and children were the primary measures of his wealth, not stocks and IRAs or pensions or bank accounts. Wives and children and cattle determined the nature of his wealth. The wives and children then were a promise of future security. The more children, the more security in your old age. To have children, many children, was to have a kind of social security that no government could give because there was no government to give it. And this is not simply common to Hebrew culture and society. This is common to all ancient societies, the large Chinese society, the large Japanese family, the large Hebrew family. So to have multiple wives was to assure the possibility of having many more children than any one wife could possibly bear. Adultery then had nothing to do with a man's sexual relationships with his multiple wives or even unmarried women. It had something to do with his having sexual relationships with another man's wife. What was that? It was another man's property. Like stealing his wallet, like taking his car, like taking something from him that accrued to his wealth. Wives weren't owned, you see, for nothing. Wives were owned for wealth. Wives were not simply married. They were selected for their breeding possibilities. They were kept to ensure inheritance, rights, and lineage. You can see it through all the English kings, for instance. There's no difference in those concepts. Consequently, an adulterous woman was a married woman who had sexual relations with any man other than her husband. She could be divorced under those circumstances, or she could be stoned to death. And in some of the villages in many parts of the world today, that is still operational. Sex, as we know it, was by and large a woman's sin. Now, in case you've ever run up against that in your own life, at least you'll have the comfort of knowing where they got the idea. Polygamy, the taking of more than one wife, was a given. But polyandry, the taking of more than one husband, was absolutely forbidden, at least in this society. At the same time, rabbinic law decreed the care of the woman. Rabbinic law decreed that for the sake of the woman, 4 wives ought to be enough for any man, they said, and still do in Islamic societies. If the women in the family were to be treated decently, then there ought not to be so many of them that they did not get sufficient human attention or be treated justly and fairly or enjoy sufficient resources. So, what is to be gained here that can possibly give new spirit to our own age, where 1 out of every 2 marriages among us now ends in divorce? The word implied by the 6th commandment is commitment to the needs of others. Commitment to the needs of the other. And that is the key to any marriage, whatever its form, wherever it is. And the marriage breaks down when one person refuses to take the needs of the other as their own. You shall not commit adultery brings us back to when there was such a thing as a genuine cultural notion of permanence. The idea that things could last and should last and would last if we continue to tend to them. It It was a culture with much shorter lifespans and many fewer options and a much smaller body of relationships to be engendered or raised up in the society. But it does make us think again of what it means to be family, any family. It requires us to delve deeply into the spiritual meaning of the constancy of the relationship and genuine commitment to enduring responsibilities. You see now in our own culture, those with great commitment to family, even if the relationship breaks down, are moving into a whole new form of blended families so that each partner's responsibility to the children as well as to the past partner is maintained. That's the same kind of concept that is emerging in Judaism here. Marriage, in other words, is about eternal human significance. It's not about sex. Sex can be had with anyone. Significance, relationship, commitment. Once that couple marries, they will be married in some form forever. Because every time that child walks in the door, that relationship, that first relationship, it takes on a real life. That kind of marriage isn't about ownership. There's no such thing as the ownership of any other human being. It's not about using another person to assure our own security. Marriage is about significance. Significance. Surrounded by thousands of strangers at one time, we are doomed to insignificance until we are significant to someone else. The person in a crowd with no relationship whatsoever has yet to know the feeling of significance. Marriage is about finding out what is missing in ourselves and in being willing to provide what is missing in another, so that both of us may become the person we're really meant to be. The relationship must go beyond casual or commercial or even self-satisfying sex to intimacy, to knowing the other, to supporting the other, to bringing presence to both their strengths and their weaknesses, to encouraging their potential and their dreams. That other person is a person. They don't exist for me, but they will be the foundation of my life, provided that I am also the foundation of theirs and they the foundation of mine. That's intimacy. It's about enabling one another to be everything they can be, so that every day we can become something better together. That's why marriage is a concern of the community. That's why these are community-building words. It affects not only the couple themselves, but it affects the development of the whole society around them. This is the notion that what we affect in a relationship is far beyond ourselves. It affects the security and the identity of the children also, that will be the world's future. We seek relationships because none of us is self-sufficient. Only by giving ourselves into the care of another for the sake of the other can we ourselves become fully known, fully challenged, fully human. The capacity to form and maintain relationships, any good psychologist will tell you, is one of the signs of mental health. Relationships call us to psychological maturity. I may go into this relationship a self-centered narcissist, but if I have any potential for health in me and the love turns beyond sex to intimacy, I myself will grow. These relationships nourish our ability to respond empathically to others, to the neighbor, to the person who's been wounded, to the sick, because I know what feelings are. And I can feel now for other people's feelings. What's the difference between an adolescent and an adult? An adult, we hope, knows what it's like to feel for someone else. An adolescent feels only for the self. That's the nature of adolescence. That's the right stage in life for that. But when you're still like that at 50, you've missed something. The loop is still open. Otherwise, our world encompasses simply the breadth of our own concerns. Our perspective shrinks to the level of the narcissistic, and we become a world unto ourselves, and that is a very puny world indeed. You shall not commit adultery. Commitment is the word that calls us to truly care for the other people we love, not to use them, not to exploit them, not to ignore them, not to patronize them, not to manipulate them. It calls us to recognize that people are neither toys nor trophies. The trophy wife has got to go. The toy boy is not an acceptable part of a relationship. In this relationship, two equals are meant to become more together than they could ever be alone. We treat the sixth commandment as if it were about physical misbehavior. But the sixth commandment is really about sincerity of heart, integrity of commitment. The sixth commandment is not about not loving. It is about loving rightly, meaning with the soul, as well as with the body, with the mind and the personality, as well as with our connections. It's about loving for the long haul, in season and out, with the soul, far more than with the body. Which is why simply substituting another body for it never works. That's just an empty stage in a misty phase of nothingness. As Joe Murphy, the essayist, puts it, marriage should be a duet. When one sings, the other claps. The message is clear. Thou shalt not commit adultery means that if the feelings begin to unravel between two people, they need to ask, who isn't clapping? Otherwise, the whole community will be weaker.
Doesn't that just put things in perspective? I think I like this because I often use it in marriage prep. I personally find it a bit difficult because I'm divorced. And so, it touches me heart a bit. But here's what Joan says. The world is a great, gaping, vacuous place where we are doomed to insignificance until we are significant to someone else. Marriage is about eternal human significance. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes trust, it takes honesty, it takes forgiveness, and it takes emotional stability. It takes surrender to the process of growth. But so, Joan likes to tell little stories. So in here, she says, the Hindus tell a story that may say more about the real meaning of the sixth commandment than we might at first glance. Once upon a time, the story goes, a disciple very much wanted to give up his life in the world and become a renunciate. A not unusual religious discipline in that culture. The problem, he explained, was that his wife and family loved him too much to let him go. Love, his guru said, that isn't love at all. Love frees. Listen. And he gave the disciple a yogic secret that would enable him to stimulate, or no, please, but that would enable him to simulate. Even I find that ridiculous. To simulate the state of death. The next day, the man was dead to all outward appearances, and the house trembled with the cries and wailing of the family. Then the guru showed up and told the weeping family that he had the power to bring the man back to life, if only someone could be found to die in the disciples' place. Any volunteers? To the corpse's astonishment, every member of the family began to explain why it was necessary to keep their own lives. Finally, the corpse's wife said, "There's really no need for anyone to take his place. We'll manage without him." The poor man was really flabbergasted. But more importantly, adultery is when we take someone else's life and love, use them up, and then go on our own way, managing without them. We live in a world, and she mentioned 1 in 2 marriages. It's a terrible statistic. And yet, we must look to the positive, the beauty of the relationship. It's a commandment about integrity of heart, about loving people more spiritually than we can insist on loving them physically. And that is so true. So now that's all that I must say for tonight, and you will now get your questions to reflect on. Simulate and stimulate, I mean really.